Welcome to your friendly neighborhood historian, where we discuss just enough history to inform, intrigue, and entertain. I'm Bill Petro. The history of Macintosh, a 41-year love affair. The now famous Macintosh computer turns 41. When Apple President Steve Jobs launched this computer at the Flint Center on the De Anza College campus on January 24th, 1984, to the theme from the film Chariots of Fire, he called it insanely great. The $1.5 million 1984 Super Bowl commercial filmed by Sir Ridley Scott had appeared on TV 2 days before Macintosh went on sale, and the world was holding its breath. The age of personal computers debuts. When IBM released the so-called IBM PC in 1981, I was at a Silicon Valley startup at the time and remember telling my workmates that it legitimized the desktop microcomputer market, at least for business. Though it was called a personal computer, few people I knew had one at home. It was driven to popularity with MS-DOS, a character-based user interface, initially with green characters on a black screen, and then later in living color. The PC had been around for almost a decade, all the way back to the Xerox PARC Alto machine, but those were too expensive and complicated for ordinary mortals to use. The more hobby-friendly Commodore PET, Atari, and TRS-80 were within people's budgets, but were primarily used by hobbyists, or what were called nerds. Early developers and adopters used the CP/M operating system machines from Compaq in the business world. Even Apple II computers were around then. But Macintosh was something different. Steve Jobs didn't call it the Macintosh, but just Macintosh, like James Cameron's movie, referring to the big boat as Titanic, as if it had a name. Mac was truly a personal computer, ideal for the home and professionals and educational environments. It was remarkable in that it had a graphical user interface, called a GUI, that even kids could figure out. I started each of my children on Mac when they were just 2 years old. It had a mouse menu-based operating system that did not require memorizing commands and typing classical geek on the keyboard. And it had a bitmapped screen, allowing the drawing of any shape or picture on the screen, not just characters. And it had lots of fonts. I worked with one in 1984, but got my first one in 1985 as part of the Apple Developer Program. I drove to the Apple loading dock in Cupertino and picked up my toaster box. That's what they were called back then. I'd already spent a few hours with one in the office, where only the marketing execs or publication staff got to use them. I was the corporate IT manager administering 3 super mini computers then, and Macintosh was a curiosity. My office mate had one and showed me how to use MacPaint and MacWrite, the only 2 programs shipping with the system, and I was hooked. Using a text-based terminal program, I would use my Mac from home to dial in remotely via modem to check the office and what the status of the various systems were. When I later moved on to Sun Microsystems in Silicon Valley, I used the same terminal program to do shell access to my work computer and keep up with my email and Usenet. I had gotten what was called the Fat Mac, which was just like the initial 128 kilobyte Mac, but now with 512 kilobytes of RAM memory. Who could need more? Macintosh came with 1 floppy drive and no hard drive. But later, a SCSI port was added to allow for a hard drive. For just $1,000, I got a 10 megabyte hard drive to which you could network 2 Macs together. This was living large. Macintosh in the 80s. I regularly attended the monthly meetings of the A32 Computer Club in Silicon Valley in those early years. These were attended by fellow geeks interested in the Apple 32-bit system, also known as the Motorola 68000-based Macintosh. That was the microprocessor. I met the early Macintosh team from Apple there and heard how they developed a particular system or what they were working on currently. From the original development team, Andy Hertzfeld showed us Servant, which was later named Switcher. It was an early quasi-multitasking system for Mac. I was in heaven. Also, Apple evangelist Guy Kawasaki would come out to speak. He was a regular favorite, always fascinating and funny. He would say to us, "Now at the end of my talk, I'd like to open it to Q&A, or question and avoidance. You ask the questions, I'll avoid answering them." I was so into it back then that I wrote articles and product reviews for a Macintosh journal. In 1987, when I worked at Sun, Apple released Macintosh 2, the first color open architecture expandable system. Sun co-founder Bill Joy had one of these on his desk, just 2 doors down the hall from my office. I'd walk by his office often just to drool. Like Sun, Apple continued developing more robust systems using faster 68000 chips. Sun used the same industrial design company that Apple used, the German company Frog Design. However, a marriage between Apple and Sun was not to be. While at Sun, as the program manager on the independent software vendor account Interleaf, which was a high-end desktop publishing package, I wrote articles on the Macintosh ecosystem. I had the opportunity to visit the Apple campus in the late 80s and even tour the lab. There I saw a Cray XMP supercomputer. It was a thing of beauty to behold. It was there to design the next Macintosh. The company founder of Cray, Seymour Cray, famously said, "I use a Mac to help design the next Cray." Macintosh in the 90s. In 1990, Microsoft launched Microsoft Windows 3.0. It shared some of the same design elements of the Macintosh user face, and though not as good, it was deemed by many to be good enough. The market responded to the cheaper Windows PC, which became the market share leader. In the 90s, I traveled internationally with a Macintosh PowerBook Duo, a very small and light laptop that was a real head-turner. However, when I traveled to China, I could not connect any projection system to it unless I brought a docking station along. In the mid-90s, Apple licensed the Macintosh operating system to third parties to create clones. This foray into openness was shut down at the end of Mac OS System 7. I recall a talk at the San Francisco Macworld Expo, the biggest show of its kind, at the newly opened Moscone Center, from which I would typically bring home 20 pounds of brochures. This talk was given by then Apple executive Jean-Louis Gasset, where he gave an astounding proprietary talk called How to Keep the Japanese from Eating Our Sushi. In any event, this was not as fatal as many pundits predicted. Today, at almost $4 trillion, Apple has amongst the highest market capitalization of any high-tech company, if not every company in the world, even more than Microsoft. The later 90s were not as kind to Macintosh. Popular software applications became available on Windows first and on Mac only much later, if at all. I'd often ask software vendors if they were planning a Macintosh version, and the answer was usually, if there is market demand for it, which was code for no. By the way, I had to start carrying a Windows laptop for my international travel, and I wandered in the Windows wilderness for almost a decade. In 1994, Apple left the Motorola processor line behind for the IBM PowerPC, as the reduced instruction set computer, or RISC architecture, seemed a good idea then. Even Sun had supported SunOS and Solaris on both Motorola 68000 and the PowerPC architecture, before moving entirely to Sun's SPARC RISC chip. SPARC stands for Scalable Processor Architecture. Macintosh in the 2000s and beyond. Apple in 2005 announced abandoning PowerPC for the Intel x86 architecture, allowing Mac to run Windows or Mac OS, or both nowadays, using virtualization technologies like VMware or Parallels. Around the same time, my wife complained how her slow Windows laptop was running so slowly that she couldn't get anything done. I explained to her that in order to fix it, I would need to first back it up, then reformat the disk drive, then reinstall Windows, and finally restore all the applications and data. This was the usual response from Microsoft Windows support. In other words, lift off the radiator cap, then drive a new engine underneath it. Or I could spend $600 on a Mac Mini. We went with that choice. It took me just 20 minutes to set up her Mac and get it online. I was having so much fun with her machine that she kicked me off after a month, so I got my own, an iMac, the successor to the original all-in-one Macintosh. I've had 4 since then, and I haven't looked back. Macintosh is no longer the biggest moneymaker for Apple. First iPod surpassed it, then iPhone. In 2020, Mac moved to its 4th processor architecture, the Apple Silicon ARM-based RISC processor. It screams like a veritable bat out of the flaming inferno of the nether regions. I still have my original 9-inch screen Mac, and now I have a wonderfully portable MacBook Air. And I've worked for companies that were civilized enough to supply me with a MacBook Pro. Happy 41st birthday, Mac. Thank you for listening. I'm Bill Petro, your friendly neighborhood historian. You can find more details on this topic and others on my website at billpetro.com.